Joseph Smith. You've probably heard the name. He's one of America's most influential and controversial religious figures. But today, we're not diving into theology. Nope, we're talking about the law. Because for Joseph Smith, the courtroom was as central to his story as the pulpit. It was this constant, defining, and incredibly complex battleground.
So let's set the scene. It's 1843. Joseph Smith turns to his scribe and makes this incredibly bold statement. I acknowledge myself a very great lawyer. You'd think he was about to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court or something. And then, literally seconds later, comes the punchline. Right after his grand declaration, he grabs a stack of law books, arranges them on his desk, and uses them as a pillow to take a nap. Seriously, this little moment, captured by his scribe, is the perfect snapshot of the paradox of his life. A man with zero formal training who was, nonetheless, constantly and deeply tangled up in the American legal system. Now, to really get Smith's story, you have to understand the world he lived in, because the legal system on the early 19th century American frontier, it was nothing like what we have today. Think of it as the Wild West of law. It was informal, accessible, and honestly, pretty chaotic. I mean, just look at this. Forget about fancy courthouses. Court was often held in a tavern, or a school, or somebody's living room. Most judges weren't trained lawyers. They were just respected guys from the community. And you know what? People liked it that way. They trusted common sense way more than complicated lawyer's law. This created a system where a guy like Joseph Smith could step right in and feel like he could play the game.
And here's the real irony. Smith himself shared that public distrust of lawyers. He often called them persecutors and railed against what he called vexatious lawsuits, basically lawsuits just designed to harass somebody. So the very man who was so critical of the legal system would end up using it and being targeted by it more than almost anyone else around him.
So, how did this all play out? Well, from his early 20s right up until his death, you could almost read Joseph Smith's biography as one long, complicated court record. Lawsuits were just this constant shadow hanging over his life. This map really drives home the sheer scale of it. As he moved his community west, starting in New York, then to Ohio, on to Missouri, and finally settling in Illinois, the legal troubles followed him every step of the way. This wasn't just a one-off thing, it was a defining pattern. And you can see a clear escalation on this timeline. It starts in 1826 with a pretty minor, if strange, charge related to his folk beliefs. A decade later, it's massive civil suits over a bank collapse. The very next year in Missouri, it's treason, a capital offense. And by 1844, it's a full-blown storm of charges that ultimately leads to his death. So what was that first charge? Glass-looking. It was essentially a folk magic charge. Smith was accused of being a disorderly person for using a seer stone, what he claimed helped him see things, to find lost treasure for a client. This is so fascinating, because right from the get-go, his spiritual practices were being interpreted by the law as a criminal act. When you sort through the hundreds of legal actions, they really fall into three main buckets. First, you've got civil suits, which were almost always about money and debt. Second, criminal charges that exploded out of conflicts over power and control. And third, criminal charges that took aim at his controversial private life. A lot of the civil cases weren't actually that unique to Smith. He was trying to do huge things, building temples, starting a bank. That took a ton of money. So when the Panic of 1837 hit, a massive nationwide economic depression, credit just vanished. Creditors everywhere started suing to get their money back. Smith and his church were swept up in this tidal wave of lawsuits for unpaid debts. The criminal charges, on the other hand, were often way more explosive. In Nauvoo, Illinois, Smith wasn't just the prophet, he was the mayor and the general of the local militia. He held all the power. So when a group of dissenters published this newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, criticizing his power and especially his secret practice of polygamy, Smith, acting as mayor, ordered the printing press to be destroyed. That single act directly led to charges of riot and treason, and it set the stage for his final, fatal confrontation. And this is where his private life became a very public, criminal matter. Just before he died, a grand jury indicted him for adultery. This quote is pulled directly from the actual indictment. His secret practice of plural marriage was suddenly no longer a rumor, it was a formal legal accusation with a specific woman named in the court documents. So we've built this picture of Smith as a guy who was constantly on the defense, always being hounded by the law. But that's only half the story. And the other half?
Well, it's a major twist that changes how you see everything.
77. What in the world could that number mean?
That's the number of legal cases that Joseph Smith himself presided over as a judge. You heard that right. As mayor of Nauvoo, he was also the city's chief justice. The man who spent his life in the defendant's chair was now sitting behind the bench. He wasn't just a target of the law anymore, he was actively wielding it, hearing everything from minor stuff like disorderly conduct all the way up to felonies like larceny. The defendant had become the judge.
So, after a lifetime spent in court, on both sides of the bench, what are we supposed to make of all this? Smith's staggering legal record has left behind two completely opposite interpretations of who he was.
On one hand, you have the persecution narrative. His followers saw the endless stream of lawsuits as a weapon, used by enemies to harass and destroy their faith. They pointed things like the governor of Missouri's infamous extermination order against all Mormons as undeniable proof of the hostility they faced. In this view, Smith was a prophet of God under constant siege. But on the other hand, you have the consequence narrative. Critics argue that, hey, the lawsuits were just the natural result of Smith's own actions, from risky financial schemes to the social chaos caused by polygamy to the flat-out illegal act of destroying a printing press. In this view, he was a charismatic but deeply flawed man caught in a legal web of his own making.
Ultimately, the court documents tell a clear story of a man whose entire life was defined by the law. But the big question, what that story means, that remains. Was he a prophet besieged by a hostile world that used the courts as a weapon against him? Or was he a powerful and controversial leader whose own choices inevitably dragged him into one legal conflict after another? The record is there, but the verdict, that's yours to consider.